Today, we're going to take a brief look at representation information and consider how you can create the best information for your audience. By the end of this video, you should have a basic understanding of what representation information is, understand the need for it, be able to identify some basic aspects of representation information in practice, and understand how and why you should tailor this information to match your audience's knowledge base. So what is representation information? The Open Archival Information System model defines it as the information necessary to render and understand the bit sequences constituting the content data object. In more straightforward terms, it is the information needed to allow the intended audience to render and understand the record which has been preserved. The most basic example of representation information is the software which is required to translate bits into a renderable form. With more complicated bit sequences, this may require hardware and its manual to be included. Other examples of representation information include the file path name, byte size, format version, etc. There are several reasons why representation information is crucial to preservation. The underlying advantage is that it is needed to render and understand the records we preserve, and without it, these records would remain as bits, meaningless to the human eye. An easy way to understand this is to consider this presentation. With the correct hardware and software, we are able to render this slide, but without an understanding of the English language, you may not be able to understand the information within it. As such, an English dictionary may be recommended in the representation information. As well as creating an understanding of preserved records, representation information may also inform which format you preserve records in. This is because you may choose a format based on its ability to be self-describing, referring to the format's ability to extract relevant metadata to inform your representation information. To make representation information, you first have to find it. At its most basic level, this can be done easily on your computer. Although the following example uses a Chromebook, the steps can be followed on most computers to find similar information. By going to your files, locating the file you are preserving and right-clicking on it, you are given the option to get info. On other systems, this may be properties, view details, etc. Clicking on this provides us with basic information about the file, which we can use for our representation information. For example, we could include the file location so the user or software can locate the file, a necessary step in rendering the preserved record. As well as this simple method, specialist software such as Droid and JHove can be used to extract more specific and technical information for your representation information. As this software is more complicated, we will not be covering it within this tutorial. In addition to these methods, there are also technical registers which are useful when compiling representation information, such as pronoun. Firstly, they allow you to see the technical requirements and information for specific software. And secondly, it provides a means to test that the format you have is consistent with the official format. Testing consistency against external documentation is important to ensure the format will be able to render your record correctly. Hopefully, you now have a basic understanding of what representation information is, why it is important, and how you can identify some of the basic aspects of it. To finish this presentation, we will consider how your intended audience will influence its implementation. This is because when planning your representation information, you need to consider your designated community's knowledge base, which will influence how much information you need to include. This is because the more informed they are on the topic, the less information you need to include, and vice versa. Returning to the example of this presentation and needing a knowledge of English to understand it, if we consider a Spanish archive trying to preserve it, if we accept the user can render it, they would still not be able to understand what has been rendered as it would be in English. As such, the Spanish archive should include a link to a Spanish to English dictionary in its representation information to ensure its users can understand what has been preserved. This demonstrates the importance of considering your audience's knowledge to ensure you give them enough information to understand what has been rendered. On the other hand, if an English archive were to preserve the presentation, they would not need to include a dictionary as their target audience would already understand English. This would save resources for the service by not having to spend time finding an appropriate dictionary. Although this is a basic example, the underlying principles are important. Whilst in practice, language may not be a common example, there are many real examples you may have to consider. For example, if a city council is preserving the records for a decommissioned nuclear power station, their usual audience may not be able to understand this, so it would be worthwhile including links to nuclear authorities or the manual for any specialist software being used to ensure any visitors who do look at the record are able to understand the information preserved. By considering your audience, you can adapt your new knowledge of representation information to best serve your intended audience and be realistic about how much resources you need to dedicate to these.